All right. So we talk a lot on this channel about how whenever mainstream media sources are reporting on what is happening in Gaza right now, they tend to use what's called the passive voice, right? So you'll see an example, right? If they're talking about what happened on October 7th, it was a massacre, it was a slaughter, Israelis were murdered by Hamas, right? And then if they're talking about an Israeli strike inside of Gaza, they'll use this kind of passive, vague language. A blast went off that the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says killed people who were allegedly identified as children. Sometimes it's as ridiculous as that. And there are a lot of different reasons why these media outlets do this, but with CNN specifically, we just got a new report that came out, here from Daniel Boguslaw of The Intercept, on just how deep their pro-Israel bias goes when it comes to their reporting on what's happening right now. So here from Daniel, CNN runs Gaza coverage past their Jerusalem team operating under the shadow of an IDF censor. So the details of this are absolutely wild. Not unexpected, but pretty wild. They say whether reporting from the Middle East, the United States, or anywhere else across the globe, every CNN journalist covering Israel and Palestine must submit their work for review by the news organization's bureau in Jerusalem prior to publication under a long-standing CNN policy. While CNN says the policy is meant to ensure accuracy in reporting on a polarizing subject, it means that much of the network's recent coverage of the war in Gaza and its reverberations around the world has been shaped by journalists who operate under the shadow of the country's military censor. And this also ties into previous reports that we got from on the ground from CNN. And when you go and you have people embedded with the IDF, okay, or you have people embedded in Israel, they have to allow the IDF to censor whatever footage they're getting from on the ground. So I'll ask you guys, do you think that the IDF, that the Israeli government, is going to allow them to put forward any footage that is going to make them look bad? Probably not, right? And it also goes deeper than that, because it's not necessarily just an IDF shadow censor who is telling them you can't cover this or you can't release this footage directly. It also goes deeper than that, because if you are running everything through your Jerusalem bureau, then what do you think the incentives are for the people who work in Jerusalem? Well, they're probably going to be the people who are closest with the IDF, who are closest with the Israeli government, and they have an incentive to maintain access, to not really piss anybody off around them. And so even if you don't have directly an IDF censoring the news that you are reporting, there is still going to be an impact just from running it through that bureau because of the people who work there having their own specific incentives, right? So there's a whole host of different problems here. But they continue. Like all foreign news organizations operating in Israel, CNN's Jerusalem bureau is subject to the rules of the IDF censor, which dictates subjects that are off limits for news organizations to cover, and censors articles that it deems unfit or unsafe to print. As The Intercept reported last month, the military censor recently restricted 8 subjects, including security cabinet meetings, kind of an important thing to report on there. Now, granted, maybe you can make an argument, okay, they of course they're not going to allow CNN to publish something that is like a direct security threat to them. But I'll tell you guys that it's not just that deep, right? It's not just things that are like, oh, this would directly result in Hamas getting their hands on this information and attacking us in X, Y, and Z way. It's much broader than that, right? But it includes security cabinet meetings, information about hostages, and reporting on weapons captured by fighters in Gaza. In order to obtain a press pass in Israel, foreign reporters must sign a document agreeing to abide by the dictates of this censor. CNN's practice of routing coverage through Jerusalem does not mean that the military censor directly reviews every single story, but again, he says still, the policy stands in contrast to other major news outlets, which in the past have run sensitive stories through desks outside of Israel to avoid the pressure of the censor. On top of the official and unspoken rules of reporting from Israel, CNN recently issued directives to its staff on specific language to use and avoid when reporting on violence in the Gaza Strip. So here's where we get into that passive voice that we constantly see. The network also hired a former soldier from the IDF's military spokesperson unit to serve as a reporter at the onset of the war. I mean, what kind of perspective do you think that a former IDF soldier and the IDF's military spokesperson unit is going to have. You think they might have a warped perspective here? And it gets even worse further down in this article, but we'll touch on that. They say, one member of CNN staff who spoke to The Intercept on the condition of anonymity for fear of professional reprisal, for obvious reasons, said that the internal review policy has had a demonstrable impact on the coverage of the Gaza war. Quote, every single Israel-Palestine related line for reporting must seek approval from this bureau, or, when the bureau is not staffed, from a select few hand-picked by the bureau and senior management, from which lines are most often edited with a very specific nuance that favors Israeli narratives. Right? So again, it wasn't an Israeli airstrike that killed a bunch of children in a safe zone that Israel told them to go to. No, it was just a strike. A strike killed people in Gaza, right? It just removes the accountability for Israel. It doesn't tell you the full scope of what is going on. And I have a perfect example of this that I saw just the other day. Now, this isn't from CNN, but I'm showing you this because it gives you a perspective to show that it's not just CNN. It is all of these major news outlets, and I've seen countless dozens of examples of this since October 7th. But, I mean, look at this headline, right? The Associated Press, strike kills 12 people, mostly children, in Gaza area declared safe zone by Israel. So, I mean, this one's, it's not as egregious as some of the other ones that I've seen. But again, strike kills 12 people. A strike did not kill 12 people. Israel's strike killed 12 people, mostly children, as they point out here, in an area that Israel told them to go to. So the real framing here is Israel told these people that where they were or where they had to go to was a safe zone, and then they intentionally killed them anyways. That's what's actually going on here. You wouldn't get that perspective from this. You would just think, maybe something happened. Maybe there was a random strike. Maybe it was Hamas. Maybe it was, whoever it could be. Something happened, and then these children died. It just removes all of that, intensity and accountability for the actual actor that is involved. They're the ones responsible for this, right? CNN's team in Jerusalem are the people closest to the Israeli government, as I was saying, in a situation where a government has been credibly accused of singling out journalists for violent attacks in order to suppress information. To give that government a heightened role in deciding what is news and what isn't news is really disturbing. And that's a really good point there. And I mean, I've talked about the attacks on journalists throughout the entirety of this war, and also before this war. I mean, it was over, I think, like almost 2 years ago now, that Shireen Abu Akleh was assassinated in cold blood by Israeli security forces when she was on the ground doing her journalistic work. She was assassinated. She was shot by an Israeli sniper, okay, I believe in the neck. And she was wearing her press vest, just like this guy is here in this video, had press clearly labeled everywhere, and they were targeted. Why were they targeted? Because she was doing fantastic journalistic work on what is actually happening in the West Bank, in Gaza, wherever the case may be. And so that's why they're targeting these journalists. And they've killed over 100 journalists, according to that Euromed human rights monitor that we've been tracking. Over 100 just since October 7th. It's by far, as they point out here, been the deadliest war for journalism in modern history, right? And that's not an accident. It's not a whoopsie daisy. It's intentional. It's a part of their strategy so that people cannot tell the stories of Palestinians who are suffering on the ground right now. And this was one of the latest one, Wael Dadu's son. And this is a guy who I've referenced before because he had several other members of his family that were killed by Israel in other targeted strikes. And now he just lost his son yesterday. I mean, I don't know how much more a single human being can possibly go through, but I mean, this is the same guy who had some of his colleagues killed and literally went out and did a report on his colleague's death with, bandages from bullets that he had been struck with, right? And so this guy's been doing incredible work, and I mean, again, losing another one of his family members is obviously tragic, but it's not an accident. This guy is having his family, and maybe even inevitably himself, targeted by Israel for his reporting on the ground. Also hear from Ryan Grimm. There were estimated to be about 1,000 journalists working in Gaza before October 7th. Israel has now killed more than 10% of them. 10% of the journalists working in Gaza, and 1% of the total population. A press vest at this point is a target, not protection. Also hear from Noah Colwyn in terms of some of their crackdowns here on people who have dissenting views with inside Israel or with inside the West Bank. He says, and he's responding to this PBS NewsHour headline that was pretty insane, "This is just incorrect. Israel has for years had a policy of arresting people for their social media posts. I reported about this exactly 6 years ago," right? And again, this gives you another perspective in terms of the narrativizing here by the media on some of these headlines. Hamas has pumped out propaganda on social media, prompting Israel to start its own media campaign to drum up support. So Hamas is doing propaganda. Israel is doing a media campaign. I mean, in one sentence, you see the double standard there. I would say they're both doing propaganda. It's in the middle of a war. I've seen the Hamas videos. I've seen the Israeli videos. They're both doing propaganda. Propaganda doesn't necessarily have to have a positive or a negative connotation. But to pretend as if they're different is just absolutely absurd. Of course, Israel's running their own psychological operations within inside Israel. Of course, they are pumping out their own warped propaganda to try to bring people over to their side or to downplay the suffering of Palestinians. They also say those efforts have resulted in Palestinians and Arab citizens of Israel arrested for social media posts. So it's just a gross mischaracterization of what is happening here. I mean, what's actually happening is they are mass arresting people for showing any sort of sympathy with Palestinians inside of Israel. I mean, this has happened to teachers, it's happened to, numerous different people inside of Israel who are Israeli citizens even, who are arrested for showing sympathy for children who are being, slaughtered in Gaza right now. And so, it extends inside of Israel itself, where you're having more and more authoritarian crackdowns for anybody who would dissent from whatever, Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right government are doing right now. It also extends to the West Bank, where they have just been rounding up dozens and dozens or hundreds of people during this war, and also dramatically escalating their, settler terrorism and the expansion of the settler settlements inside of the West Bank as well, under the cover of this war and the attention that it has gotten. So you have that, and just to further that point here from the American Prospect, Israel rounds up Palestinians for social media posts. A new national security task force has initiated 250 prosecutions, mostly against Palestinian students. Detainees have been held in maximum security prison for weeks, and I've seen pictures of some of the people who go into some of these prisons, and a couple of months later they come out, and they literally look like, those old pictures of Holocaust victims, where their faces are sunken in, and, it looks like there have been reports of many of them being tortured in Israeli control. And so, I mean, it doesn't get more authoritarian than this. And this is the country. I mean, I say all of that, the killing of journalists, the targeting of journalists, the mass arrests of people for, speaking out with dissenting views. I say all of that to say this is the country, this is the military that CNN is allowing to have influence over their coverage of what is going on. I mean, it's the last place that you would want to have influence on your reporting if you want to be objective. They continue in this article, though, saying, earlier in the war, on October 26, CNN's News Standards and Practices Division sent out an email to staff outlining how they should write about the war, saying, quote, Hamas controls the government in Gaza, and we should describe the Ministry of Health as Hamas-controlled. So there we have our answer. I've seen this so many different times, and I'm constantly like, why the fuck do they keep saying it's the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, other than to try to downplay or make it seem as if their reporting or the numbers that they were putting out are inaccurate? I mean, what is the purpose of that? Because it gives off the impression to the reader, to your average person, that Hamas militants are putting these numbers out, when that's not the case, right? It may be under the branch of Hamas, that's the ruling government in Gaza, sure, but the interpretation there is not accurate, because the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry has been incredibly accurate over the years, not just in this, but in previous, situations where it's been fact-checked by UN reporters, by, other human rights organizations, even by the United States itself, and they've been proven to be accurate. But somehow all of these media organizations got together and they decided, well, we're going to label everything as Hamas-controlled, again, to get rid of some of its legitimacy, right? Whenever we are referring to casualty statistics or other claims related to the present conflict, if the underlying statistics have been derived from the Ministry of Health in Gaza, we should note the fact that this is Hamas controlled, even if the statistics are released by the West Bank part of the ministry or elsewhere. The email goes on to acknowledge that CNN's responsibility to cover the human cost of the war, but couches that responsibility in the need to cover the broader current geopolitical and historical context of the story, while continuing to remind our audiences of the immediate cause of the current conflict, of course, October 7th, the Hamas attack and kidnapping of Israeli civilians, right? Which is just kind of ridiculous at this point, as if we haven't seen tens of thousands of people killed in Gaza. Are we really supposed to be expected to say that all of this is just the result of October 7th, that Israel has no agency whatsoever in the mass slaughter of civilians, including men, women, children, over 11,000 children that have been killed so far? I mean, the targeting of journalists, the targeting of mosques and schools and UN shelters and refugee camps and hospitals and all of the rest of that. And then when you're reporting on something like that, if they ever report on that, right, you have to couch it by saying, well, this is still the result of October 7th. I mean, it's just, it gives people, again, a warped perspective in the minds of your average reader who may see that, oh, well, this is of course this is in result of, what happened on October 7th, therefore it's all justified. No, it's not justified. And so it's little games like that they play, right? Obviously, it's important to talk about what happened on October 7th as one of the causes of this, major offensive into Gaza. But October 7th is not the reason that Israel is doing all of what they're doing in Gaza. This is part of a broader plan to ethnically cleanse the region of Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank. And so that's their actual underlying goal here. It's not some sort of like a hunt for Hamas that they're only going after Hamas militants who attacked them on October 7th. That's not the case. But they say the language of the directives mirrors similar orders, of course, from CNN management at the start of the Afghanistan war back in 2001, when the chair, Walter Isaacson, ordered foreign correspondents at the network to play down civilian deaths and remind the readers that the violence they were witnessing was a direct result of the attacks on September 11th. And of course, how many innocent civilians were killed as a result of us going into Afghanistan, right? And justifying it as, oh, well, this is because of 9/11, so therefore it's all justified, right? Keep in mind, right? Don't think about those innocent civilians as innocents because, this has to do with 9/11, right? As if they were responsible for 9/11, as if the Palestinians in Gaza right now who are being blown to shreds, as if they're responsible for October 7th. They're not. They say also in October, CNN hired a former IDF soldier to contribute writing and reporting to CNN's war coverage. Tamar Michaeli's first byline appears on October 17th, 10 days after Hamas's attack inside southern Israel, and since then her name has appeared on dozens of stories citing the IDF spokesperson and relaying information about the IDF's operations in the Gaza Strip. At least one story bearing only her byline is little more than a direct statement released from the IDF. I mean, that's not journalism. According to her Facebook profile, she served in the IDF spokesperson unit, a division of the Israeli military charged with carrying out positive PR both domestically and abroad. Again, you think she's going to have a fair, balanced perspective here? Last year, the spokesperson unit was forced to issue a public apology for conducting psychological operations, or psyops, against Israeli civilians, right? This is who CNN is having write some of their shit. I mean, it's totally absurd. And I'll finish off with this. The CNN staff member described how the policy works in practice. Again, here's how we get that passive language. War crime and genocide are taboo words. Why are those taboo words? If a war crime is committed, then it's a war crime that has been committed. You should report on it as such, right? If there is a genocide happening, there are credible allegations of a genocide that are happening, according to human rights organizations, according to that recent South African charge that is going to be adjudicated soon at the International Court of Justice, then you should use those words. Again, the goal of journalism is not to be neutral, it's to be objective, and there's a big difference between those things, right? It's like having on some oil lobbyist to talk about climate change and pretending as if, their perspective is equally as valid as a climate scientist. No, they're not, right? In the same way that, actual direct reporting on the ground from human rights organizations, from the United Nations, from people who are actually experiencing this on the ground, journalists who are on the ground reporting on this, that does not have equal weight with biased and warped lies from the IDF, one of the least credible organizations in terms of information in the world. But that's how they report this. If anything, they're biased much more towards the IDF. That is, again, completely unreliable. But they say war crime, genocide, these are taboo words. Israeli bombings in Gaza will be reported as blasts attributed to nobody until the Israeli military weighs in to accept or deny responsibility. They're literally just doing whatever the IDF wants them to do. Quotes and information provided by Israeli army and government officials tend to be approved quickly, while those from Palestinians tend to be heavily scrutinized and slowly processed. And that's exactly, what we've been seeing from all of these different organizations, right? Any claim that is made by a Palestinian or somebody who is even pro-Palestinian, right, or even reports that come off as anti-Israel from the United Nations or human rights organizations, those are always slow-rolled, and they're always projected as sort of like claims and, maybe this is true, maybe it's not true, the IDF is denying it, but then if it's a statement coming from government officials in Israel, if it's a statement coming from the IDF, then it's like, okay, we can report on that, that's trustworthy, as if they're trustworthy. I mean, the IDF has been caught lying time and time and time again. They're not a reliable source of information. If anything, you should take what the IDF says and probably assume that it's false or warped until proven otherwise. If anything, that would probably get you to be more accurate more of the time, to assume that they're probably lying about at least some of what they're saying. But this gives you, again, a good perspective in terms of Number one, why we've seen the kind of coverage from mainstream media sources, including CNN, that we've seen since October 7th. Now, granted, there are great, caveats to that. There are examples of journalists who work at CNN and other mainstream outlets who do fantastic work, and they do push through, the bullshit and tell, stories in an accurate and a good way. I'm not trying to say it's all individuals, but just as a network, you see the problem with the mainstream media, with corporate media, with this sort of access journalism, right? And again, it's important to realize that this is why we need more independent voices, right? This is why we need independent journalism at the end of the day. And so I'll keep you guys updated. I'm going to have a new couple of other, Israel-related videos today and tomorrow. So, that's it. I mean, it's not unexpected, but it is pretty shocking to see it laid out this clearly.